When it comes to dating the sagas of Icelanders, scholars are often surprisingly vague. We frequently get the dictum that these works were written down in the 13th and early 14th centuries. Unfortunately, more precision than that is usually not possible. The fact is that no saga can be ascribed to a historical author with any certainty. No saga is preserved with an original autograph, and we only have them in manuscripts that are younger than the composition itself, sometimes much younger. Anyone who wants to date a particular saga must find arguments that demonstrate how much older the text is than the oldest manuscript that preserves it. Most of the scholarly writings on the issue are based on circumstantial evidence. Key factors in dating the sagas of Icelanders are the style and vocabulary of a saga, references to historical events, and quotations from other sagas. When a saga quotes another saga, we can at least be sure that the quoted saga is older. But it's actually more complicated than that. When sagas were copied, scribes habitually undertook some changes, sometimes to the extent that one can rightfully speak of an original composition rather than merely a copy. So when a saga quotes another saga, it may not be quoting the version we now have of that particular saga. Several attempts have been made to arrange the sagas of Icelanders into age categories. A common practice is defining three groups: early sagas, composed between 1200 and 1250, classical sagas, composed between 1250 and 1300, and post-classical sagas, composed after 1300. It's a familiar formula and analogous to many other contexts of literary history, a diachronic three-period model with a rise, blossom, and decline. With a paradigm of this kind, early saga is the label attached to those works that seem primitive, mainly because they are written in an archaic language and because they are believed to include elements of orality in a high proportion when compared to other sagas. Otherwise, they may lack the sophisticated sense of structure that is incidental to highly developed literary systems. There are exceptions to this rule, most notably Egil's saga, which is commonly believed to have been written in the 1220s. That one certainly has no teething problems. On the contrary, it counts as one of the finest specimens of the entire saga corpus. As for the second group, the term classical obviously indicates an exemplary standard, and the received opinion has long been that the mid to late 13th century is the heyday of the sagas of Icelanders. Njál's saga is sometimes seen as the very pinnacle of the genre. It is normally dated to the 1280s, so an evolutionary model of the sagas would assume that sagas written after that moment somehow displayed marks of decline, or at least a shift of taste and a transformed view of the genre in terms of style, content, and structure. The post-classical sagas have a higher degree of folkloristic motifs, and the narrative realism that is seen as a hallmark of the classical sagas is compromised more often in the later sagas. Some of the later sagas of Icelanders can even be seen as generic hybrids, demonstrating a fusion with the legendary sagas and the chivalric sagas, with more fantastic or romantic elements than the classical sagas. The 14th century in Iceland saw a great increase in international affairs and more formal ties to the Norwegian court than before. Consequently, Icelanders had a better access to all things continental and Christian, and the latest literary trends arrived quicker than before. Let's take a short look at the three sagas highlighted in our course. When Eyrbyggja saga was published in the 1930s, the editor dated the saga between 1200 and 1245. Among his arguments for this date was simply that the saga's vocabulary looks old, that it has no substantial influence from the chivalric sagas and should therefore be classified as an early saga. Later scholars have revised this, most notably Torfi Tulinius, who has suggested the 1250s as a likely date, based on the saga's concern for the balance of power between clerics and chieftains. Torfi thus interprets the saga event as a projection of the issues that were under debate during the time of writing. In the case of Njáls saga, the manuscript evidence suggests that the saga was finished not long after 1285. The legal terminology of the saga, however, indicates that the author was familiar with Járnsíða, a law code introduced in Iceland in the year 1271. Because of this, the dating of Njáls saga can thus be pinned down with some certainty to a relatively narrow period. Grettis saga is the youngest of the three, regularly assumed to have been composed in the early 14th century. The text of Grettis saga includes several loanwords from foreign languages, and the frequent use of proverbs is one of the saga's trademarks. Both these stylistic features indicate that the author was well educated in continental literature. 4 times the saga text cites a man called Sturla Þórðarson, an Icelandic chieftain and chronicler who died in the year 1284. The common assumption is that Sturla is one of the author's informants, and that the author must have known him personally. As a consequence, the saga could then hardly have been written much later than the early 14th century. Nonetheless, even if Sturla's involvement gives us the terminus post quem, or the earliest possible date of Grettis saga, we can't be sure about the saga's latest possible date. Some scholars have actually conjectured that the saga is a lot younger than was formerly believed, and that it may even have been composed as late as shortly before the year 1400.